Millions of years before written history, the world humans lived in looked almost unrecognizable. Entire lands vanished beneath rising seas, giant creatures disappeared, and the first cities slowly emerged from the ruins of prehistory. Tonight, we're exploring what really happened between the prehistoric world and the rise of ancient civilization. Welcome to Sleepy Earth Channel. Before we begin, leave a comment below telling me what city you're watching from tonight. And let's journey back into the forgotten beginnings of human history together. There was a time when the world did not feel permanent. Coastlines moved within the memory of generations. Forests swallowed entire valleys and then vanished. Giant animals crossed open plains that no longer exist today, and humans followed them through landscapes that would now seem almost alien. Long before pyramids, kings, or written history, the Earth itself was changing so violently and so quickly that some scientists believe the people living through it may have felt as if the world was ending around them. And in many ways, it was. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age was beginning to loosen its grip on the planet. For thousands of years before that moment, enormous sheets of ice covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. Some glaciers stretched more than a mile thick. Entire continents looked pale and silent beneath endless frozen horizons. Sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today, not because there was less water on Earth, but because so much of it was locked away inside ice. Places that are now underwater were once dry land. Humans walked across regions now buried beneath the North Sea. Vast coastal plains existed where oceans roll today. Entire ecosystems thrived in places modern maps no longer remember. In North America, mammoths wandered through cold grasslands alongside giant bison, enormous ground sloths, dire wolves, and saber-toothed cats. Europe held woolly rhinoceroses and reindeer migrations so large they may have darkened entire valleys as they moved. For prehistoric humans, survival depended on understanding these animals, following seasonal patterns, and adapting constantly to climates that could shift within a lifetime. But then the warming began, slowly at first, almost invisibly. Temperatures rose across the planet as Earth emerged from the Ice Age. Glaciers began retreating northward. Rivers swelled. Forests expanded into lands that had once been frozen steppe. And with that warming came one of the greatest transformations in human history, though the people living through it could not possibly have understood how enormous it truly was. The world they knew started disappearing, piece by piece. One of the strangest parts of this transition is how unstable the climate suddenly became. Scientists studying ancient ice cores drilled deep into Greenland discovered evidence that temperatures did not simply rise in a smooth line toward the modern world. Instead, the climate lurched violently. Some periods warmed rapidly. Others suddenly plunged back into near glacial cold. One of the most mysterious of these episodes is now called the Younger Dryas. Roughly 12,900 years ago, after a period of warming had already begun, temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere dropped sharply again. In some regions, conditions may have returned to near Ice Age cold within just a few decades. Forests retreated, weather patterns shifted, ecosystems destabilized. For people already living close to survival, this would not have felt like a small environmental change. It would have felt catastrophic. And what caused it remains debated even now. Some scientists believe massive floods of fresh water from melting glaciers disrupted ocean currents that normally distribute heat around the planet. Others have explored a far more dramatic possibility, that fragments of a comet or asteroid may have struck Earth, triggering fires, atmospheric dust, and rapid climate disruption. Evidence for the impact theory remains controversial, and many researchers remain unconvinced. But the fact that the debate still exists reveals how strange this period truly was. Something enormous was happening to the world, and humans were caught directly inside it. At almost the exact same time, many of the great Ice Age animals began disappearing. Mammoths vanished from most of their range. Giant ground sloths disappeared from the Americas. Saber-toothed cats, giant beavers, massive elk, and countless other species faded away over surprisingly short spans of time. The reasons are still argued about today. Some researchers point toward climate instability, destroying habitats faster than large animals could adapt. Others believe expanding human hunting played a critical role. Some suspect it was both at once. A perfect ecological collapse created by environmental stress combined with increasingly skilled human predators. Whatever the cause, the disappearance of these animals changed humanity forever. For tens of thousands of years, humans had lived as highly mobile hunter-gatherers, moving through enormous open landscapes filled with megafauna. Entire cultures, migration routes, and survival strategies were built around these creatures. Then, suddenly, within only a few thousand years, much of that world was gone. And perhaps even more shocking than the loss of the animals was the loss of the land itself. As glaciers melted, sea levels rose by more than 300 feet over time. But this did not happen evenly or peacefully. Some periods may have involved sudden pulses where coastlines moved dramatically within generations. Ancient campsites, hunting grounds, and river valleys disappeared beneath advancing oceans. Places where humans may have lived for centuries simply vanished underwater. Today, researchers continue discovering evidence of submerged prehistoric landscapes beneath modern seas. Off the coast of Britain lies Doggerland, a vast region that once connected the British Isles to mainland Europe. Thousands of years ago, it held rivers, forests, animals, and human communities. Now it rests beneath the cold waters of the North Sea. Fishing boats occasionally drag up prehistoric bones and tools from the seabed, fragments of a drowned world, almost completely erased from memory. Similar submerged landscapes exist in many parts of the world. Along the coasts of Southeast Asia, areas that were once enormous plains connecting islands together disappeared beneath rising seas after the Ice Age. Some researchers suspect these flooded regions may have supported large human populations long before recorded civilization appeared elsewhere. It is a strange thought to consider that some of humanity's earliest stories may now lie hidden beneath oceans, unreachable except through scattered clues preserved underwater. And perhaps this helps explain one of the most persistent patterns found across ancient cultures: flood myths. From Mesopotamia to India, from Native American traditions to stories preserved in Southeast Asia, ancient societies repeatedly described catastrophic floods that destroyed older worlds. The details vary enormously. Some stories involve angry gods. Others describe survival boats, sacred mountains, or chosen survivors. Historians do not treat these myths as literal historical records, but many researchers believe some flood traditions may preserve distant cultural memories of real environmental disasters that occurred as sea levels rose after the Ice Age. Not a single global flood swallowing the entire Earth all at once, but generations of terrifying regional floods, collapsing coastlines, and disappearing homelands repeated across centuries. For people with no scientific understanding of climate systems or glacial melt, such events could easily become woven into sacred stories about divine punishment or the destruction of earlier ages. In some ways, this period may represent one of the greatest forgotten psychological transformations in human history. Humans had evolved for hundreds of thousands of years in relatively small, mobile groups deeply connected to seasonal movement and wild landscapes. But as climates stabilized after the Ice Age, environments changed. Forests spread into open hunting territories. Large prey animals became scarcer. Populations slowly increased. And in several parts of the world, humans began experimenting with something radically different: staying in one place. Not immediately, not all at once, and probably not because they believed it was a superior way to live. Early farming was difficult, physically exhausting, and nutritionally limited compared to some hunter-gatherer diets. But environmental pressure may have narrowed humanity's options. As old ecosystems disappeared, people adapted in new ways. Wild grains became increasingly important in some regions. Small seasonal camps gradually became permanent settlements. Humans who had once followed migrating herds now found themselves tied to rivers, fertile soil, and harvest cycles. It is difficult to overstate how revolutionary this change was. Nearly every structure of modern civilization eventually emerged from this transition: ownership of land, stored food, borders, wealth accumulation, social hierarchy, organized religion tied to place, written records, cities, armies, kingdoms. None of these belonged to the ancient Ice Age world. They emerged afterward during the long and uncertain recovery from climatic chaos. And yet the transition was not smooth or inevitable. Archaeological sites from this period reveal societies experimenting, adapting, and sometimes collapsing. In the Near East, some communities appear to have settled down before fully developing agriculture. Others built large ceremonial structures long before cities existed. One of the most mysterious examples is Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, a massive ritual complex built over 11,000 years ago by people who may not yet have practiced full-scale farming. Huge carved stone pillars, arranged in circles, rise from the earth there, older than Stonehenge by thousands of years. The site challenges older assumptions that organized civilization emerged only after agriculture created surplus food and stable populations. Instead, some archaeologists now wonder if shared belief systems and ritual gatherings may have helped push humans toward permanent settlement in the first place. In other words, the desire to gather, worship, remember, and create meaning together may have reshaped civilization just as much as hunger did. That possibility changes the story completely, because it suggests the end of prehistory was not simply about survival. It was also about imagination, about humans trying to understand a rapidly changing world filled with floods, disappearing animals, unstable skies, and landscapes transforming within living memory. Somewhere inside that chaos, people began constructing entirely new ways of organizing reality itself. New gods appeared, new myths formed, new social structures emerged. Humanity was no longer just surviving nature. It was beginning to reshape the world deliberately. But the deeper mystery is how much was lost during that transition. Most human stories from this era vanished forever because writing did not yet exist. Entire cultures disappeared without leaving names behind. Countless migrations, conflicts, discoveries, and beliefs dissolved into silence long before history began recording anything. What survives are fragments, buried tools, drowned forests, ancient bones, mysterious carvings, traces of fire beneath layers of sediment, tiny pieces of evidence scattered across a vanished age. And sometimes, looking at them feels less like studying history and more like staring into the remains of another world entirely. Because, in truth, that is exactly what the end of prehistory was. Not just the end of the Ice Age, not simply the extinction of mammoths or the flooding of coastlines. It was the collapse of one human reality and the beginning of another. A turning point so enormous that nearly everything familiar to modern civilization grew from its aftermath. The cities, religions, empires, technologies, and systems that would later dominate the ancient world all emerged from people struggling to survive the death of an older Earth. And somewhere beneath modern oceans, forests, and deserts, the missing chapters of that transformation may still be waiting to be found. For most of human history, people did not belong to cities, kingdoms, or borders. They belonged to movement. Entire generations lived without permanent homes, crossing enormous distances through forests, coastlines, frozen plains, and open grasslands that stretched beyond the horizon. To modern minds, this kind of life can sound harsh or unstable, as if humanity was waiting for civilization to rescue it from endless wandering. But the deeper archaeologists study prehistoric hunter-gatherers, the stranger that assumption begins to look. In many ways, these people were not primitive survivors desperately searching for a better system. They were highly skilled humans, perfectly adapted to a world that no longer exists. They understood animal migrations, weather patterns, edible plants, seasonal rivers, and landscapes in ways modern people rarely do. Some groups traveled hundreds of miles through territories mapped entirely in memory. Others built temporary camps so sophisticated that evidence suggests they returned to the same locations for generations. And perhaps most surprising of all, many hunter-gatherers may have worked less than early farmers who came after them. Studies of surviving foraging societies suggest some spent fewer hours gathering food than agricultural communities later spent planting, harvesting, grinding grain, repairing fields, and managing livestock. The old image of prehistoric life as non-stop misery is no longer accepted as easily as it once was, which creates a difficult question. If hunting and gathering worked so well for so long, why did humans stop? Why abandon a lifestyle that had carried humanity through hundreds of thousands of years? Why trade movement for permanent settlement? Why exchange dietary variety for dependence on a few fragile crops? And why did this transformation happen in multiple parts of the world within roughly the same broad period after the Ice Age? The answer may begin with pressure. Not sudden pressure, but slow environmental stress building across generations until old survival strategies no longer worked as reliably as before. As the climate stabilized after the Ice Age, forests spread across many open hunting grounds. Large game animals became scarcer in some regions. Human populations gradually increased. Certain groups may have found themselves competing over shrinking territories rich in food. In places where wild grains grew naturally, people began returning seasonally to harvest them. Over time, temporary camps lasted longer. Storage pits appeared. Stone tools for grinding grain became more common, and slowly, almost invisibly at first, some humans stopped following the world and began trying to reshape it instead. One of the most important regions in this story lies in an area modern historians call the Fertile Crescent, stretching across parts of the modern Middle East. Thousands of years ago, this region looked very different from the dry political maps people imagine today. Seasonal rains, rivers, grasslands, and wild cereal plants made it unusually rich in resources. Here, groups known today as the Natufians began building semi-permanent communities long before full agriculture emerged. Archaeologists have uncovered stone houses, food storage areas, sickle blades used for cutting grain, and even cemeteries, suggesting stronger attachment to particular places. But these people were not fully settled farmers yet. They still hunted gazelle and gathered wild foods. They existed somewhere between two worlds, and that transitional stage may have lasted far longer than people once assumed. Agriculture was probably not invented in a single dramatic moment. It appears to have emerged gradually through countless experiments spread across generations. Humans likely noticed that dropped seeds grew near campsites. Certain plants may have been protected accidentally at first, then deliberately later. Over time, people began selecting crops with larger seeds, softer husks, or more predictable growth. Without realizing it, humans started reshaping the evolution of plants themselves. Wheat, barley, rice, maize, none originally existed in the form people know today. They became dependent on humans at the same moment humans became dependent on them. And dependence is really the heart of this story. Farming did not simply change how humans ate, it changed how humans related to time, land, labor, risk, and even the future itself. Hunter-gatherers moved through environments that already existed naturally. Farmers stayed in one place and attempted to control nature directly. That required planning months ahead. Seeds had to be planted before food existed. Entire communities became vulnerable to drought, flood, pests, or crop failure. Survival was now tied to a single location. And once people invested labor into land, the meaning of territory changed forever. Land was no longer just part of the landscape. It became something worth defending, something that could belong to someone, something that could create power. This may have been one of the most important psychological revolutions in human history. Ownership became more meaningful once humans stopped moving constantly. Stored food created inequality because some people controlled more resources than others. Permanent homes created inheritance. Villages created boundaries. Over time, these changes slowly produced social hierarchies that had rarely existed in highly mobile hunter-gatherer bands. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural settlements often reveals signs of harder physical labor, nutritional deficiencies, and increasing disease compared to some earlier populations. Living close together with domesticated animals exposed humans to new illnesses. Diets became narrower, heavily dependent on grains. Skeletons from some farming communities show evidence of repetitive stress injuries from grinding grain or working fields daily. In a strange way, early agriculture may initially have reduced quality of life for many people, even while allowing populations to grow dramatically. This is one reason some researchers have described farming not as humanity's greatest invention, but as a trap humanity slowly fell into. That idea remains debated, but it reveals how complicated this transition really was. Civilization did not arrive as an obvious improvement everyone immediately embraced. In many places, humans may have resisted fully settling down for thousands of years because mobile life still worked better in certain environments. Some societies continued hunting and gathering long after farming appeared nearby. Others mixed both lifestyles together. The shift was uneven, messy, and deeply human. And perhaps the strangest part is that agriculture emerged independently in different regions across the world. In China, early communities domesticated rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, humans gradually transformed wild teosinte into maize over generations. In the Andes, potatoes became essential. In New Guinea, people cultivated root crops in highland valleys. These developments did not spread outward from a single civilization teaching everyone else. They arose separately because humans across the planet were confronting similar environmental pressures and possibilities after the Ice Age. Yet even as settlements grew larger, many early communities still carried echoes of older prehistoric life. Rituals tied to animals remained common. Seasonal migrations did not disappear immediately. Some settlements appear occupied only part of the year. Others expanded and collapsed repeatedly. Humanity was experimenting with permanence, but permanence still felt uncertain. And nowhere does that uncertainty feel stranger than at sites like Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey. Nearly 9,000 years ago, thousands of people lived there in tightly packed mud brick homes built directly beside one another. with almost no streets between them. Residents climbed ladders through openings in rooftops to enter their homes from above. Inside, walls were decorated with paintings, animal imagery, and human burials beneath floors. The settlement feels strangely familiar and alien at the same time. Part village, part psychological transition into a new human reality. People were no longer simply surviving in nature. They were now living inside environments made almost entirely by other humans. That changes the human mind in subtle ways. In mobile societies, identity is often tied closely to kinship, memory, landscape, and movement. In settled societies, identity becomes increasingly tied to place, property, occupation, and social role. Over generations, entirely new forms of power emerge from that stability. Certain families control better land. Certain individuals manage food storage. Religious leaders gain influence through rituals connected to harvest cycles and fertility. Eventually, these structures harden into systems, and systems tend to grow. But even as humans built villages and planted fields, nature still remained terrifyingly unstable. Evidence suggests periods of drought may have pressured communities repeatedly during this era. Crop failures could destroy settlements. Sudden climate shifts still occurred. Some researchers suspect that environmental stress may have accelerated innovation because communities living near survival thresholds were forced to adapt rapidly. In this sense, civilization may not have emerged from comfort at all. It may have emerged from instability, from humans trying to create predictability in a world that refused to stay predictable. And there is another mystery hidden beneath all of this. Why did humans become so emotionally attached to staying in one place once settlement began? Because permanent communities offered something beyond food production. They offered continuity. Ancestors could now be buried beneath homes. Sacred places could remain fixed for generations. Stories became tied to particular rivers, hills, fields, and buildings. Memory itself changed once humans stopped moving constantly. The world became layered with human history. A village was no longer simply a shelter. It became a map of identity, death, family, and belonging. That emotional transformation may have mattered just as much as agriculture itself. In some ancient settlements, archaeologists have found evidence that homes were rebuilt repeatedly in the same exact spots over centuries, almost as if people refused to let go of certain locations. The land was no longer temporary. It had become part of who they were. Yet, there was a cost hidden inside this new way of life. The more humans settled, the more vulnerable they became to conflict. Stored grain could be stolen. Valuable land could be conquered. Larger populations required organization, leadership, and eventually, enforcement. Some of humanity's earliest walls may not have been built to keep nature out, but to keep other humans away. The roots of organized warfare likely deepened alongside permanent settlement. Mobility had once allowed groups to avoid conflict simply by leaving. Farmers could not leave so easily. Their survival was buried in the soil around them. And perhaps that is the deepest irony in the story of why humans stopped wandering. Settlement created stability, but also dependence. It created community, but also hierarchy. It produced food surpluses, but also inequality. It allowed civilization to rise, but slowly separated humanity from the wild rhythms that had shaped human existence for nearly all of prehistory. By the time the first true cities eventually appeared, humans had already crossed an invisible threshold. The species that once followed mammoth herds across open Ice Age plains had transformed into something entirely different. A species building walls, storing grain, marking borders, and reshaping the earth itself. But beneath the foundations of every future kingdom and empire remained the memory of an older human world. One where survival still depended not on owning the land, but on knowing how to move through it. The first cities did not appear all at once, like something rising suddenly from the darkness of prehistory. There was no single moment when humanity woke up and decided to build civilization. Instead, the earliest cities emerged slowly, almost accidentally, out of thousands of small decisions repeated across generations. A shelter rebuilt in the same place. A storage pit dug slightly deeper than before. A wall raised for protection. A ritual site visited season after season until temporary gathering places became permanent. And somewhere along that long transition, humans crossed another invisible threshold. For the first time in history, large numbers of people began living packed tightly together in spaces entirely shaped by human hands. The world was no longer mostly wilderness, interrupted by camps. Now, there were settlements where smoke rose every day, where food was stored year-round, where children grew up surrounded not by open migration routes, but by buildings, neighbors, boundaries, and routines. And perhaps the strangest part is that no one fully understands why this transformation happened when it did. Archaeologists once believed the sequence was simple. Agriculture came first, creating food surpluses. Surpluses allowed larger populations. Larger populations created cities. Cities then produced organized religion, social classes, governments, and eventually civilization itself. It sounded logical, clean, predictable. But the deeper researchers looked into the oldest settlements on Earth, the more complicated the story became. Some of humanity's earliest monumental structures appeared before true cities existed. In some places, ritual activity may actually have helped create urban life rather than emerging afterward, which raises a possibility that still unsettles historians today. Humans may not have built cities only because they needed food or security. They may also have built them because they needed meaning. One of the most mysterious places connected to this question lies on a hilltop in modern Turkey. Today, it is called Göbekli Tepe, and even now, more than 11,000 years after it was built, the site feels almost impossible. Massive stone pillars carved with animals rise from circular enclosures buried beneath the earth. Some of the stones weigh many tons. The carvings include foxes, snakes, birds, wild boars, and abstract symbols whose meanings remain uncertain. What makes the site so shocking is not only its age, but who built it. The people responsible may still have lived primarily as hunter-gatherers. This challenges one of the oldest assumptions about civilization itself, because for decades, historians believed large, organized construction projects required agriculture, kings, labor systems, and settled urban populations. But Göbekli Tepe appears older than all of those things. Somehow, prehistoric people without cities or metal tools organized enough labor to carve, transport, and arrange enormous stones in carefully planned ritual spaces. And no one knows exactly why. Some archaeologists believe the site was ceremonial, perhaps connected to ancestor worship, seasonal gatherings, or spiritual rituals tied to animals and the changing world after the Ice Age. Others think it may have functioned as a social center where scattered groups gathered regularly, exchanging goods, stories, marriage partners, and beliefs. There are even theories suggesting that the effort required to support these gatherings may have encouraged the development of agriculture nearby. If true, that would reverse the old narrative completely. Instead of farming creating religion, shared ritual may have helped create farming. In other words, civilization may have begun not with economics, but with belief. That possibility changes how the first cities feel. They stop looking like cold systems built only for efficiency and start looking more like emotional structures, places where humans tried to anchor themselves in a changing world. And the world was still changing rapidly during this era. Temperatures stabilized after the Ice Age, but landscapes continued transforming. Rivers shifted, forests spread, human populations slowly increased. In fertile regions, settlements grew larger because staying near reliable water and food sources became increasingly practical. Yet permanence created new problems. The more people gathered together, the more complicated daily life became. Waste accumulated. Disease spread more easily. Conflicts emerged over resources, territory, and authority. Humans were now living in social environments unlike anything their species had experienced before. One of the earliest settlements showing this transition in extraordinary detail is Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey. Nearly 9,000 years ago, thousands of people lived there in tightly packed mud brick homes pressed directly against each other without streets between them. From above, the settlement would have looked almost solid, like one continuous structure spreading across the landscape. People entered homes through openings in the roofs using ladders. Daily life unfolded in dim interior spaces stained by smoke from indoor fires. Families slept, cooked, worked, and buried their dead beneath the floors of their homes. That detail alone changes the emotional atmosphere completely. Ancestors were not placed far away in separate cemeteries. They remained physically beneath the living. Memory, death, and domestic life existed together inside the same structures. The walls themselves were often painted with hunting scenes, geometric patterns, or symbolic imagery. Some rooms appear more elaborate than others, leading researchers to debate whether early social differences were already emerging there. Yet, unlike later cities dominated by palaces or kings, Çatalhöyük shows surprisingly little clear evidence of centralized authority. There are no massive royal tombs, no obvious temples towering over the population. The settlement feels strangely collective, almost experimental, as if humanity was still testing what urban life could become. And that may be exactly what was happening. The first cities were not fully formed civilizations appearing overnight. They were unstable human experiments. Some flourished briefly and disappeared. Others evolved slowly over centuries. Many likely failed entirely for reasons now forgotten. But together, they marked the beginning of a new kind of human existence. For the first time, people spent their entire lives surrounded mostly by strangers rather than close kin groups. That changes the psychology of a species. In small nomadic bands, nearly everyone knows one another personally. Trust depends on direct relationships. But cities require different systems. Shared rituals, shared rules, shared identities larger than family. The rise of urban life likely transformed how humans thought about cooperation itself. This is one reason religion may have become increasingly important as settlements grew larger. In small groups, social behavior can be controlled through personal relationships and memory. In large settlements, belief systems help unify strangers under shared moral structures and symbolic worlds. Temples, rituals, sacred symbols, and myths may have acted like invisible architecture, holding early urban societies together long before formal governments fully developed. Some researchers even argue that religion functioned as one of humanity's earliest social technologies, a way of organizing large populations before modern institutions existed. But cities also intensified inequality. Once food could be stored and land controlled, certain individuals or groups inevitably gained more influence than others. Skilled craftsmen, traders, ritual leaders, and organizers accumulated prestige. Over time, status became increasingly visible through housing, objects, and burial practices. Archaeologists studying early urban settlements often notice gradual signs of hierarchy appearing layer by layer across generations. Civilization did not suddenly invent inequality, but cities allowed it to become permanent and structural in ways mobile societies often prevented. Trade expanded dramatically as settlements grew. Obsidian, shells, pigments, animal skins, and rare stones traveled across enormous distances. Some ancient trade networks stretched hundreds of miles long before formal empires existed. This matters because it reveals something profound about early cities. They were not isolated. Even the oldest settlements were part of larger webs of movement, exchange, and communication. Ideas traveled alongside goods, religious symbols spread, technologies spread, farming methods spread. Human societies that once lived relatively separated now became increasingly connected. And with connection came acceleration. Innovation no longer remained trapped within single groups. One discovery in one region could slowly ripple outward across continents over generations. Yet, despite these advances, early cities remained fragile. Crop failures could devastate populations. Droughts could empty settlements. Disease spread faster where humans lived densely together alongside domesticated animals. Evidence from some early urban centers suggests cycles of expansion and collapse repeated frequently. Civilization was not a steady upward march. It was unstable, vulnerable, and deeply dependent on environmental conditions humans still barely controlled. This fragility may explain why so many ancient societies became obsessed with cosmic order. Across different regions, early urban cultures tracked the movement of stars, seasons, solstices, floods, and celestial cycles with remarkable attention. In agricultural societies, survival depended on predicting nature accurately. The sky became more than beautiful. It became essential. Some of the earliest monumental structures on Earth appear aligned with astronomical events. Stone circles, temples, burial sites, and ceremonial platforms often point toward solstices or important celestial movements. This was not primitive superstition in the simplistic sense modern people sometimes imagine. It was an attempt to understand order itself. The first cities emerged in a world where environmental instability still haunted human memory. Floods, droughts, failed harvests, and changing seasons could determine whether entire communities survived. Understanding the rhythms of the cosmos felt inseparable from survival. And perhaps beneath all of this was another emotional force pushing humanity towards cities: fear of impermanence. Nomadic life leaves little physical trace behind. Camps vanish, paths disappear, but cities endure. They create continuity across generations. Buildings outlive individuals. Ritual spaces preserve memory. Walls and monuments make human presence feel permanent against the instability of nature. In that sense, the first cities may have been humanity's attempt to resist disappearance itself, to carve stability into an unpredictable earth. And yet the irony is that many of those first cities eventually vanished anyway. Some were abandoned gradually, others collapsed suddenly. Sand buried them, rivers shifted away from them, forests reclaimed them. Entire populations disappeared, leaving behind only fragments of pottery, broken walls, and bones beneath layers of soil. Modern archaeologists continue uncovering forgotten settlements across deserts, forests, and floodplains that once held thousands of people. Sometimes the ruins feel strangely familiar. Other times they feel completely alien. Reminders that civilization has never followed a single path. The earliest cities were not crude versions of the modern world waiting to become more advanced. They were unique human realities shaped by fears, beliefs, environments, and experiments very different from our own. But they changed humanity forever. Once large permanent settlements appeared, there was no easy return to the old world of endless movement across open landscapes. Cities created momentum. They concentrated labor, ideas, power, religion, and memory into single places. From them would eventually emerge writing, organized states, monumental architecture, taxation, armies, and empires. But at the beginning, the first cities were something much quieter and stranger. They were humanity learning for the very first time how to live inside a world made mostly by other humans instead of nature. Long before written religions, before temples rose above cities, before priests recorded sacred laws onto stone tablets, humans were already staring into darkness, asking questions no one could answer. They looked up at storms splitting the sky apart with light. They watched rivers flood without warning, animals vanish from entire regions, eclipses swallow the sun, and people disappear forever into death. And somewhere inside those moments, something changed in the human mind. The world stopped feeling empty. It became inhabited, not just by animals or other humans, but by unseen forces hiding behind nature itself. Spirits, ancestors, powers, eventually, gods. No one knows exactly when the first true religious beliefs appeared, because belief leaves behind almost no physical trace. Stone tools survive, bones survive, fire pits survive, but thoughts vanish unless humans attach them to symbols, rituals, or objects. And yet, archaeologists have found hints scattered deep across prehistory, suggesting humans were thinking spiritually far earlier than people once believed. Some Neanderthal burial sites appear to show bodies intentionally placed in careful positions, sometimes alongside tools, flowers, or animal remains. The evidence remains debated, but if even part of it is correct, it raises an unsettling possibility. The roots of spiritual thinking may stretch back before modern humans fully dominated the earth. Long before civilization, another species may already have wondered what happens after death. As Homo sapiens spread across continents, signs of symbolic behavior became increasingly clear. Cave paintings appeared in deep underground chambers far from ordinary living spaces. Human figures blended with animal forms. Handprints covered stone walls like messages left behind across time. In caves such as Lascaux in France or Chauvet, prehistoric artists painted bison, horses, lions, mammoths, and strange abstract markings with astonishing detail and movement. Some of these paintings are more than 30,000 years old. And even now, standing inside those caves feels strangely emotional, because the images do not look random. They feel intentional, ceremonial, almost sacred. Researchers still argue about what the paintings meant. Some believe they were connected to hunting rituals, attempts to spiritually influence animals before hunts. Others think they may reflect early mythologies, shamanic visions, or symbolic storytelling. In some chambers, acoustics amplify sound in unusual ways, leading to theories that chanting or rituals may have occurred there. No one knows for certain, but it is difficult to escape the feeling that these spaces mattered deeply to the people who entered them. And what is fascinating is how early spiritual thinking appears, tied not to civilization, but to uncertainty. Hunter-gatherers lived in environments where survival depended on forces humans could not control. Storms, migrations, droughts, disease, fertility, fire, death. All of it felt unpredictable and alive. In that kind of world, it may have been almost natural for humans to imagine consciousness inside nature itself. Many anthropologists believe some of the earliest belief systems were animistic, meaning humans saw spirits or living essence within animals, rivers, mountains, forests, and celestial objects. The boundary between human life and the natural world may have felt far thinner than it does today. Animals were not just resources, they were beings with power, intention, and symbolic meaning. This worldview still survives in some indigenous traditions around the world, offering possible glimpses into ways prehistoric people may have understood reality. And perhaps no figure captures this ancient spiritual world more mysteriously than the shaman. In many prehistoric and early tribal societies, shamans acted as intermediaries between ordinary life and unseen forces. Through trance states, rituals, music, fasting, or psychoactive plants, they claimed to communicate with spirits, ancestors, or supernatural realms. Some cave paintings even depict hybrid figures that appear part human and part animal, leading some researchers to wonder whether they represent shamans in ritual transformation. Again, certainty is impossible, but the pattern appears repeatedly across different cultures, separated by enormous distances and time periods. Humans everywhere seem drawn toward the idea that certain individuals could cross invisible boundaries between worlds. As settlements grew larger after the Ice Age, spiritual beliefs evolved alongside them. This is where religion begins shifting from something deeply personal and fluid into something more organized. Permanent settlements created permanent sacred spaces. Rituals tied to seasons became more important because agricultural survival depended on understanding cycles of nature. Fertility became sacred. Rain became sacred. Rivers became sacred. The sky itself became a map filled with meaning. One of the strangest developments during this era is how many ancient societies became obsessed with the heavens. Long before telescopes or formal astronomy, humans carefully tracked the movements of stars, solstices, lunar cycles, and planetary motions. Some of the earliest monumental structures appear aligned with celestial events in ways too precise to dismiss as coincidence. At sites across Europe, the Middle East, and later the Americas, stone circles, temples, burial mounds, and ceremonial structures repeatedly connect to the sky. This does not necessarily mean ancient people possessed mysterious, lost knowledge, as sensational theories sometimes claim. But it does reveal something profound about the human mind during this transition into civilization. People were searching for order. The heavens moved predictably, while life on Earth often felt chaotic. Seasons determined survival. Flood cycles determined harvests. The stars became both calendar and mythology at once. And slowly, the invisible forces humans once sensed vaguely in nature began taking recognizable forms. Gods emerged. Not all at once, and not identically across cultures, but certain patterns appeared repeatedly. Sky gods, storm gods, sun gods, mother goddesses connected to fertility and earth. deities associated with rivers, death, war, or harvests. Many ancient religions reflected the environments surrounding them. In Mesopotamia, unpredictable rivers and violent storms shaped powerful, sometimes terrifying gods. In Egypt, where the Nile flooded more regularly and predictably, divine order became central to religious thought. Religion was not separate from survival. It was survival explained through narrative and symbol. And perhaps the most persistent myth of all involved floods. Across ancient civilizations, separated by oceans and continents, stories emerged describing catastrophic floods destroying earlier worlds. Mesopotamian texts describe divine floods wiping out humanity. The Hebrew story of Noah echoes similar themes. Flood traditions also appear in parts of India, China, the Americas, and Oceania. For centuries, people debated whether these stories preserved memory of a single global catastrophe. Modern science does not support the idea of one worldwide flood covering all mountains simultaneously in recent human history. But many researchers suspect these myths may preserve cultural memories of real disasters connected to rising seas, river floods, or regional climate catastrophes after the Ice Age. What matters is not whether every detail happened literally. What matters is that humans across the world remembered destruction through water strongly enough for those memories to survive for thousands of years inside sacred stories. In many ways, gods may have emerged from humanity's attempt to emotionally survive uncertainty. Religion gave meaning to suffering, death, disaster, and unpredictability. It transformed random tragedy into narrative. A storm was no longer meaningless destruction. It became intention. A failed harvest became divine anger. Survival became connected to ritual behavior, sacrifice, morality, or cosmic balance. This did not make ancient humans irrational. Quite the opposite. In a world where science did not yet exist, religion often functioned as humanity's first large-scale system for explaining reality. And as cities grew larger, religion gained another role: social control. Shared belief systems allowed thousands of strangers to cooperate under common moral structures. Temples became economic centers. Priests became administrators of calendars, rituals, agriculture, and political legitimacy. In some early civilizations, the line between religion and government barely existed at all. Kings ruled through divine authority. Laws were presented as sacred commands. Entire societies organized themselves around maintaining cosmic order. Ancient Egypt offers one of the clearest examples. Pharaohs were not merely political leaders. They were seen as divine intermediaries, responsible for preserving balance between humanity, nature, and the gods. The annual flooding of the Nile, essential for Egyptian agriculture, became intertwined with sacred order itself. In Mesopotamia, towering ziggurats connected urban life directly to the heavens, serving as symbolic bridges between earth and divine realms. Yet, despite the rise of organized religion, older spiritual fears never fully disappeared. Death remained humanity's deepest mystery. Nearly every civilization developed elaborate beliefs about what happened after life ended. Tombs filled with objects, food, weapons, jewelry, and offerings suggest ancient people often imagined another existence continuing beyond death. Some cultures feared judgment. Others imagined shadowy underworlds, heavenly realms, reincarnation, or ancestral continuation. What is remarkable is not the differences between ancient religions, but the similarities. Humans everywhere struggled with the same terrifying awareness. Consciousness ends, bodies decay, and yet the human mind resists accepting disappearance. Gods may partly represent that resistance, a way of pushing against mortality itself. And sometimes, looking back at the oldest religions, there is a strange emotional intimacy to them modern people often overlook. Ancient gods were rarely distant, abstract beings. They were woven directly into weather, fertility, sickness, crops, war, rivers, stars, and daily survival. The sacred was not separated from ordinary life. It surrounded everything. A failed storm could mean starvation. An eclipse could feel like a cosmic warning. The boundary between physical reality and spiritual meaning remained porous. Even dreams carried enormous significance. In some ancient societies, dreams were treated almost as messages crossing between worlds. And perhaps that helps explain why early religions feel so mysterious even now. They emerged during a period when humanity itself was transforming. Cities were appearing, agriculture was reshaping survival, hierarchies were forming. Writing had not fully arrived yet, but memory was becoming collective rather than purely oral. Humans needed stories large enough to hold entire societies together. Gods became part of that structure, not merely supernatural figures floating above civilization, but emotional architecture supporting the human world itself. And yet, behind every organized religion lingered something older and darker from prehistory. The ancient fear that nature was alive, unpredictable, and impossible to fully control. Because despite temples, rituals, sacrifices, and prayers, storms still came. Rivers still flooded. Droughts still destroyed cities. People still died suddenly beneath silent stars. The gods offered meaning, but never certainty. Maybe that is why ancient religions evolved constantly. Gods changed names. Myths merged together. Beliefs adapted as societies rose and collapsed. Humanity kept searching for explanations that could make existence feel less fragile. And somewhere inside that endless search, civilization itself continued growing. Because once humans began organizing entire communities around shared invisible realities, the world would never return to what it had been before. There is something deeply unsettling about ancient stone monuments. Even today, standing beside them creates a feeling that is difficult to explain logically. Massive blocks of rock rise from empty landscapes where the civilizations that built them disappeared thousands of years ago. Wind moves through silent corridors. Shadows slide slowly across carved surfaces. And almost immediately, a question appears in the human mind. Why did people build this? Not small shelters, not practical walls, but enormous structures requiring years of labor, organization, and obsession. Again and again across the ancient world, humans dragged gigantic stones across impossible distances, stacked them with astonishing precision, aligned them with the sky, and created monuments far larger than simple survival required. Some were tombs. Some were ceremonial spaces. Some may have functioned as calendars, sacred landscapes, political symbols, or all of those things at once. But beneath every theory remains the same mystery. Why did prehistoric and ancient humans become so determined to build in stone? One reason these structures feel mysterious is because they force modern people to confront a version of ancient humanity that does not fit comfortably inside old stereotypes. For a long time, early civilizations were imagined as primitive societies slowly stumbling toward sophistication. But monumental stone architecture tells a different story. It reveals planning, mathematics, engineering, astronomy, social organization, and symbolic thinking emerging far earlier than many once expected. And perhaps nowhere does this tension between mystery and evidence appear more clearly than at Stonehenge. Rising from the plains of southern England, the monument has fascinated people for centuries. Massive standing stones, arranged in circles and horseshoe formations, sit beneath open skies that change constantly with rain, mist, and shifting sunlight. Some stones weigh over 20 tons. Others were transported from Wales, more than 100 miles away, long before wheels became common in Britain. Even now, archaeologists continue debating exactly how prehistoric builders moved them. Wooden sledges, rollers, ropes, waterways, frozen ground, all have been proposed. Experimental archaeology has shown that humans, using relatively simple tools and coordinated labor, can move astonishingly heavy stones. Yet understanding the physical method does not fully explain the emotional motivation. Why invest such extraordinary effort into this place? The construction of Stonehenge unfolded across many centuries in stages. The earliest parts of the site date back roughly 5,000 years, long before the iconic stone circle appeared. First came earthworks and burial pits. Later, wooden structures and standing stones emerged. Generations added to it gradually, reshaping the monument over time. That alone changes the way the site feels. Stonehenge was not built by a single ruler, commanding workers to complete a project quickly. It evolved slowly through memory, ritual, and continuity across centuries. Entire generations participated in creating something they themselves would never see finished. And what fascinates researchers most is its connection to the sky. The monument aligns closely with the movements of the sun during solstices. On the summer solstice, sunlight rises in alignment with keystones. During the winter solstice, the setting sun creates another significant alignment. This is unlikely to be accidental. The people who designed Stonehenge were carefully observing celestial cycles. But why? Some researchers believe the site functioned partly as a ceremonial calendar, helping agricultural societies track seasonal change. Others think the astronomical alignments carried spiritual significance tied to death, rebirth, fertility, or cosmic order. There are also theories suggesting Stonehenge may have been connected to healing rituals or ancestor worship. Human remains found nearby indicate the surrounding landscape held enormous ceremonial importance. What matters is not choosing a single explanation too confidently, because ancient monuments often served multiple purposes simultaneously. Modern minds tend to separate religion, astronomy, politics, burial practices, and social identity into distinct categories. Ancient societies often did not. A sacred site could also be a political gathering place, an astronomical marker, and a burial landscape all at once. And Stonehenge is far from unique. Across Europe, enormous megalithic structures appeared during the Neolithic period. Dolmens, passage tombs, stone circles, standing stones, and ceremonial avenues spread across landscapes from Ireland to Brittany to Scandinavia. Some burial chambers were built so precisely that sunlight enters deep inner rooms only during specific days of the year. At Newgrange in Ireland, a tomb older than the pyramids aligns with the winter solstice sunrise. For a few brief minutes each year, light travels through a narrow opening above the entrance and illuminates the dark inner chamber. Imagine the emotional impact of witnessing that thousands of years ago. In a world without electric light, where darkness carried spiritual power and seasonal survival depended on the return of the sun, such moments may have felt almost supernatural. These monuments suggest ancient people were not merely surviving nature. They were trying to understand their place within vast cosmic cycles. And perhaps more importantly, they were trying to connect human life to something permanent. Stone lasts. Wood rots. Memory fades. But stone endures across generations. In societies where written language either did not exist or remained limited, monumental architecture may have functioned as a form of memory itself, a way to preserve identity, belief, and continuity against the constant instability of life. Because life remained unstable, droughts came, crops failed, disease spread, communities collapsed, entire settlements disappeared. The ancient world was filled with uncertainty. Building in stone may partly reflect humanity's desire to create permanence in a reality that often felt fragile and temporary. And nowhere does that desire become more overwhelming than in Egypt. When people think about ancient monumental architecture, the pyramids dominate the imagination almost immediately. Rising from the desert plateau at Giza, the Great Pyramid still feels impossible at first glance. Built more than 4,000 years ago, it originally stood nearly 500 feet tall and remained the tallest human-made structure on Earth for thousands of years. Millions of stone blocks, some weighing several tons, were cut, transported, and assembled with extraordinary precision. The scale alone creates disbelief. For centuries, people assumed such achievements required lost civilizations, forgotten technologies, or outside intervention, because they underestimated ancient humans themselves. But archaeological evidence paints a more grounded and, in many ways, more fascinating picture. The pyramids were likely built by highly organized labor forces, supported by complex administration, engineering knowledge, seasonal agricultural cycles, and immense political power. Workers' villages discovered near Giza show evidence of large coordinated communities rather than slave populations chained under whips, as older myths often suggested. Yet even once construction methods become somewhat clearer, the deeper mystery remains emotional rather than mechanical. Why did rulers invest such colossal resources into tombs? The answer may lie partly in how ancient Egyptians understood death itself. For them, death was not simply an ending, it was transformation. The pyramid acted as both tomb and cosmic machine, helping the pharaoh transition into divine eternity. The alignment of structures with stars and cardinal directions reflected beliefs connecting kingship directly to the cosmos. In this worldview, monumental architecture was not vanity alone. It was sacred order made physical. And similar patterns appear elsewhere across the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose above early cities like artificial mountains connecting earth and heaven. In the Americas, step pyramids emerged independently among civilizations that had no contact with Egypt. The Maya built towering ceremonial complexes aligned with celestial events. In Peru, massive stone walls fitted together so tightly that even modern observers struggle to understand the precision achieved without iron tools. At sites like Sacsayhuaman, enormous irregular stones interlock, almost like puzzle pieces. Earthquake-resistant construction methods appear embedded within the design itself. Again and again, ancient humans demonstrated astonishing skill working with stone, long before industrial technology existed. But perhaps the most intriguing question is whether these monuments reveal not only intelligence, but a completely different relationship with time. Modern societies often build quickly for immediate function. Ancient monumental projects sometimes unfolded across generations. Cathedrals, temples, pyramids, and stone complexes were created by people who knew they would never see the final result completed. That requires a civilization thinking far beyond individual lifespan. Monumental stone architecture reflects patience on a scale modern cultures rarely experience anymore. It also reflects collective belief powerful enough to organize thousands of people toward symbolic goals. And this is where some of the more controversial theories begin emerging. Because the precision and scale of certain ancient monuments have inspired endless speculation about lost civilizations or forgotten knowledge. Popular culture often exaggerates these mysteries into fantasies about advanced prehistoric global empires or extraterrestrial builders. Mainstream archaeology does not support such claims, and there is strong evidence that ancient humans themselves possessed the creativity and organizational ability required to build these structures. Yet the popularity of alternative theories reveals something psychologically important. Modern people still struggle emotionally to accept how capable ancient societies truly were. There is almost a hidden arrogance in assuming sophisticated achievements must come from modern-like technology alone. In reality, human intelligence has not dramatically changed in the short span of recorded history. Ancient builders were every bit as human, imaginative, obsessive, spiritual, and determined as people today. They simply operated inside different worlds, and those worlds often revolved around symbols modern minds no longer instinctively understand. Many stone monuments appear connected not to practical necessity, but to sacred geography. Mountains, rivers, solstices, stars, death, ancestors, and celestial cycles shaped where structures were placed. Landscapes themselves became spiritual maps. In some cases, entire cities were aligned according to cosmological principles. Architecture mirrored belief systems. Stone became frozen mythology. Even silence mattered. Many ancient monuments were built in places where natural acoustics create strange echoes or altered sensory experiences. Rituals performed there would have felt emotionally overwhelming, especially beneath dark skies untouched by modern light. And perhaps that is part of why these monuments still affect people today. Even stripped of their original meanings, they retain emotional gravity. They feel intentional in ways difficult to ignore. Massive stones arranged carefully against the horizon remind us that ancient humans were asking enormous questions long before philosophy or science formalized them. Questions about death, time, nature, the sky, permanence, meaning. The monuments themselves became physical attempts to answer those questions. But there is another layer of mystery beneath all of this. Many ancient stone sites remain incomplete in the archaeological record. Structures were destroyed, repurposed, buried, or eroded away. Entire ceremonial landscapes vanished beneath forests, deserts, and cities. What survives today may represent only fragments of much larger symbolic worlds already lost beyond recovery. In some cases, later civilizations built directly atop older sacred sites, preserving spiritual importance while erasing original meanings. This happened repeatedly across history. Sacred places endured even when the cultures that created them disappeared. Which means some ancient stone monuments may carry memories older than we fully realize. And standing among them today, it becomes easier to understand why humans have always attached mystery to stone. Unlike wood or flesh, stone seems to resist time itself. Empires collapse, religions change, languages vanish, but stones remain beneath shifting skies long after the people who raised them are gone. And perhaps that permanence was always the point. Few stories have haunted humanity more deeply than the idea of a great flood. Across continents separated by oceans, cultures separated by thousands of years, and civilizations that never directly knew one another, the same strange pattern appears again and again. A world destroyed by water, entire populations wiped away, survivors escaping on boats, climbing mountains, or rebuilding civilization after unimaginable devastation. In Mesopotamia, there was Utnapishtim, surviving a divine flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah preserved life inside an ark while rain swallowed the earth. Ancient Greek myths told of Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving Zeus's destruction of humanity. Hindu traditions spoke of Manu, warned by a mysterious fish before catastrophic waters arrived. Flood traditions also appeared among indigenous cultures across the Americas, in parts of China, throughout Southeast Asia, and across Pacific Island societies. The details changed, the gods changed, the landscapes changed, but the core emotional memory remained remarkably familiar. Water came. The old world disappeared. Humanity barely survived. And for thousands of years, people have asked the same question. Could these stories preserve the memory of something real? Modern science does not support the idea of a single global flood covering every mountain on Earth during recent human history. Geological evidence simply does not fit that scenario. But the deeper researchers studied the end of the Ice Age, the more complicated the flood question became. Because while there may never have been one worldwide flood occurring all at once, there absolutely were enormous floods, collapsing coastlines, and catastrophic rises in sea level, reshaping human environments over thousands of years. In some regions, those changes may have been terrifying enough to become immortalized in myth. To understand why, it helps to imagine what the world looked like near the end of the last ice age. Sea levels were dramatically lower than today because vast quantities of water remained trapped inside continental glaciers. Entire regions now underwater once existed as habitable land. Humans hunted, gathered, and lived in places modern people would now see only as ocean. Then the warming accelerated. Glaciers melted, and slowly, relentlessly, the seas began rising. Over thousands of years, global sea levels climbed more than 300 feet. That number alone is almost impossible to emotionally grasp. Coastlines moved inland across entire continents. River valleys disappeared beneath advancing water. Forests drowned. Plains vanished. Human settlements that may have existed for generations were erased completely. In many areas, the process happened gradually enough that people adapted over time by moving inland. But evidence suggests there were also periods of sudden acceleration, moments when massive glacial lakes burst or ice sheets destabilized rapidly, causing dramatic flooding events within human lifetimes. One of the most famous theories connected to ancient flood myths involves the Black Sea. According to a controversial but influential hypothesis proposed in the 1990s, the Black Sea may once have existed as a much smaller freshwater lake, separated from the Mediterranean by a natural land barrier near modern Turkey. As global sea levels rose after the Ice Age, Mediterranean waters may eventually have broken through catastrophically, flooding into the basin with enormous force. Some researchers imagined waterfalls hundreds of times larger than Niagara pouring through the breach, rapidly transforming the landscape and potentially displacing human communities living nearby. The theory captured public imagination because it sounded eerily similar to ancient flood traditions from the Near East. However, later research complicated the picture. Some scientists argue the flooding may have been slower and less catastrophic than originally proposed. Others debate the timing entirely. Yet, even though the details remain uncertain, the broader reality is undeniable. Coastlines and inland seas changed dramatically during this era, and human populations witnessed those transformations directly. Another drowned world lies beneath the cold waters of the North Sea, between Britain and mainland Europe. Today, fishermen occasionally pull ancient bones, tools, and fragments of prehistoric life from the seabed. But thousands of years ago, this region, now called Doggerland, was dry land filled with rivers, marshes, forests, and human communities. People hunted there, traveled there, and likely considered it home for generations. Then, the rising seas slowly consumed it. Around 6,200 BC, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway triggered a tsunami that may have devastated remaining low-lying settlements in the region. Imagine surviving centuries of gradual coastal flooding, only to experience a sudden wall of water destroying what remained. Events like that could leave psychological scars lasting across oral traditions for generations. Similar submerged landscapes existed elsewhere across the planet. During the Ice Age, Southeast Asia contained a vast connected landmass modern researchers call Sundaland. Islands now separated by ocean were once linked by plains, rivers, and forests, supporting both animals and humans. As sea levels rose, these landscapes fragmented and disappeared beneath tropical seas. Some researchers suspect population movements caused by these floods may have influenced migration patterns and cultural memory throughout the region. In other words, large parts of humanity may literally descend from people whose homelands vanished underwater. And perhaps that is why flood stories feel emotionally universal. They reflect one of the oldest fears humans possess: the loss of home. Water destroys differently than fire or war. It erases. Flooded landscapes disappear beneath smooth surfaces where memory itself becomes inaccessible. Entire worlds vanish without ruins left standing behind. This may partly explain why flood myths often feel dreamlike and mournful rather than simply violent. They describe not only death, but disappearance. Yet flood myths are rarely just historical memories. They are also moral stories. In many traditions, floods arrive because humanity has become corrupt, violent, arrogant, or spiritually broken. The waters cleanse the world so life can begin again. This pattern appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian, Biblical, Greek, and other ancient narratives. Why? One possibility is that catastrophic floods naturally felt like judgment. Ancient people living beside rivers depended on water for survival. But rivers could also destroy entire settlements overnight. Floods blurred the line between life-giving and life-ending forces. Water nourished civilization and threatened it simultaneously. Over time, this duality became deeply symbolic. Another possibility is that societies transformed environmental trauma into moral narrative because humans instinctively search for meaning inside disaster. Random catastrophe feels emotionally intolerable. Myth gives suffering structure. And the ancient world experienced no shortage of catastrophic flooding. Mesopotamia itself, where some of the earliest urban civilizations emerged, sat between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Flooding there could be unpredictable and devastating. Archaeologists have found evidence of major flood layers in some ancient settlements, though not all at the same time or connected to one single event. Rather than one universal flood, the archaeological record suggests repeated regional disasters across centuries. To people living through them, however, local destruction could easily feel like the end of the world itself, especially in societies where the known world extended only as far as surrounding valleys and trade routes. And this raises another fascinating question. How long can human memory survive without writing? Some researchers studying oral traditions believe certain stories can preserve fragments of real environmental events for astonishingly long periods when attached to ritual, identity, and repeated storytelling. Indigenous Australian oral traditions, for example, may contain memories of coastal flooding dating back thousands of years after sea levels rose following the Ice Age. If true, it suggests some ancient flood myths could preserve distorted echoes of genuine prehistoric experiences passed down across countless generations. Not exact historical records, but emotional memories transformed through mythic storytelling over time. And perhaps this is where science and mythology stop being enemies and start becoming different ways humans process reality. Science reconstructs physical events through evidence. Myths preserve emotional truth through narrative. A flood myth does not need to describe geology accurately to reflect genuine human trauma caused by environmental collapse. Somewhere beneath the symbolism, there may still be memories of terrified communities watching coastlines disappear beneath rising water. But there is another layer to the flood mystery that makes it even more unsettling. Many ancient civilizations believed floods did not merely destroy random populations, they destroyed earlier worlds, civilizations or ages that existed before the current one. This idea appears repeatedly across mythologies. A previous humanity falls. The world resets. Survivors begin again. Some modern speculative theories stretch this concept into claims about advanced, lost civilizations erased by catastrophe. Mainstream archaeology remains highly skeptical of such ideas because there is no strong evidence for a forgotten global civilization more advanced than known prehistoric societies. Yet, the emotional power of these theories reveals something important about the flood myth itself. Humans are haunted by the possibility that entire chapters of history may already be lost forever. And in some sense, they are. Rising seas absolutely erased prehistoric coastlines where humans once lived. Archaeologists know this. Countless campsites, villages, migration routes, and sacred places now lie underwater beyond easy recovery. The deeper the oceans rose after the Ice Age, the more of humanity's earliest history disappeared with them. What we know about prehistory is already incomplete. Entire landscapes where humans may have lived for thousands of years remain buried beneath modern seas. So when ancient stories speak of vanished worlds beneath water, they may not be entirely wrong, even if the details transformed into myth over time. There is also a psychological reason floods became so central to ancient imagination. Water represents chaos. It dissolves boundaries. Civilizations depend on structure, permanence, walls, roads, farms, calendars, and predictable order. Floods erase those things almost instantly. In many ancient religions, creation itself begins with waters of chaos before order emerges. Mesopotamian myths described primordial oceans existing before the world. Egyptian cosmology imagined creation rising from watery darkness. Across cultures, water symbolized both origin and destruction at once. The flood myth sits precisely at that intersection. The old world sinks, a new one emerges. And perhaps that is why these stories endured so powerfully across human history. Because deep down, they are not only about physical floods, they are about fragility, about the terrifying awareness that civilizations, homes, and entire ways of life can vanish faster than people expect. Ancient humans lived much closer to environmental uncertainty than most modern societies do today. Rivers failed, seas advanced, storms destroyed crops, landscapes changed within memory. The world never felt fully stable, and somewhere inside that instability, humans began telling stories about waters that once swallowed everything. Stories repeated beside fires, inside temples, across generations, long before writing preserved them onto clay tablets and sacred texts. Even now, thousands of years later, those stories still linger because they touch something ancient inside the human mind. The fear that beneath every civilization, the waters are always waiting. For thousands of years, stone shaped the human world. Stone blades cut meat from animal bones. Stone axes cleared forests. Stone spear points hunted mammoths across frozen plains long before cities existed. Entire generations lived and died inside what modern historians still call the Stone Age, a period so vast it covers nearly all of human existence. And then, slowly, almost quietly at first, something began changing beneath the surface of civilization. Humans discovered that certain rocks behaved strangely when placed inside fire. Some softened, some melted, some bled glowing liquid from the earth itself. And once that secret was uncovered, history accelerated in ways no one could have predicted. Metal did not simply give humans better tools. It transformed power, warfare, trade, labor, status, and the structure of civilization itself. In many ways, the ancient world before metal and the ancient world after metal feel like two entirely different human realities. The earliest metals humans encountered were probably not mined from deep underground. They were found by accident, scattered across landscapes in rare natural forms. Native copper occasionally appears in pure metallic chunks exposed near the surface. Gold can be found in riverbeds gleaming beneath water and sunlight. Unlike iron, which requires extremely high temperatures to process, copper and gold can sometimes be shaped relatively easily using simple hammering techniques. Somewhere in prehistory, humans noticed this. Perhaps a stone cracked open near a fire. Perhaps lightning struck exposed ore. Perhaps someone experimenting with pigments or minerals discovered that heat changed certain rocks permanently. No one knows exactly when the first person understood that stone itself could be transformed through fire. But that realization was revolutionary. Fire had always held power in human imagination. It gave warmth, protection, cooked food, hardened wood, and illuminated darkness. Now it could also reshape matter itself. In some ancient societies, early metalworkers may have seemed almost supernatural. Smelting ore required controlling heat with remarkable precision compared to ordinary campfires. Furnaces glowed in darkness like living things. Smoke rose from clay structures while liquid metal emerged from stone as if summoned through ritual. It is not difficult to imagine why many ancient cultures later connected blacksmiths and metalworkers with mystery, magic, or divine knowledge. To ordinary people, transforming rock into shining blades or ornaments may have looked almost impossible. The earliest widespread metal technology centered around copper, especially in parts of the Near East. Archaeological evidence suggests humans were experimenting with copper thousands of years before the rise of major empires. At first, copper tools were relatively soft and often more symbolic than practical. Stone still worked better for many daily tasks, but eventually, people discovered something even more important. When copper was combined with small amounts of tin, it created bronze, a far harder and more durable metal, capable of holding sharper edges and surviving heavier use. That discovery changed everything. The Bronze Age did not simply introduce new tools, it introduced entirely new systems of civilization. Suddenly, weapons became stronger, agricultural tools became more effective, armor appeared, metal axes cleared forests faster, spears and swords altered warfare permanently. Societies capable of controlling bronze production gained enormous advantages over those that could not. And because bronze required both copper and tin, long-distance trade became essential. This is one of the most fascinating parts of the ancient metal revolution. Tin is relatively rare. Many major Bronze Age civilizations had access to copper, but not enough local tin to sustain large-scale bronze production. That meant early states depended on trade networks stretching astonishing distances across the ancient world. Raw materials moved through caravans, rivers, and sea routes, connecting cultures thousands of miles apart. Long before globalization existed in any modern sense, metal created interconnected worlds. Traders carried not only ore and finished goods, but ideas, technologies, symbols, myths, and diseases between civilizations increasingly tied together through economic dependency. In some ways, bronze became the first truly strategic resource in human history. Entire kingdoms rose partly because they controlled access to metals. And perhaps most surprisingly, there are periods in ancient history when tin may have been more valuable than gold. Gold carried symbolic prestige, but bronze built armies. Bronze protected cities. Bronze shaped empires. Without tin, complex states became vulnerable. That dependence created fragile systems hidden beneath the power of ancient civilizations. Because once societies organized themselves around metal production, they became tied to supply chains vulnerable to disruption. And disruptions came often. Archaeologists studying Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC continue debating exactly why several major Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations weakened or disappeared within a relatively short period. Climate stress, invasions, internal instability, trade breakdowns, earthquakes, famine, and political collapse may all have played roles. But one thing became clear. Civilizations dependent on complex trade networks were no longer isolated. A crisis in one region could ripple outward across entire systems. Metal had connected the ancient world together more tightly than ever before. Yet, before those great collapses, Metal reshaped daily life in quieter ways too. Specialized craftsmanship expanded dramatically. Metalworking required skill, training, and knowledge that not everyone possessed. This encouraged social specialization inside growing urban societies. Some people farmed, others traded, others became potters, soldiers, priests, builders, or metalworkers. Civilization became increasingly layered and interdependent, and with specialization came hierarchy. Metal objects quickly became symbols of status and authority. Wealthy elites displayed gold jewelry, bronze weapons, decorated armor, and ceremonial objects to demonstrate power. Kings buried with metal treasures projected divine legitimacy and military strength. Ancient tombs filled with bronze daggers, gold masks, and intricate ornaments reveal how deeply metal became tied to prestige and identity. In many societies, the control of metal production strengthened ruling classes because elites often controlled mines, workshops, trade routes, or military forces. Metal did not create inequality, but it amplified it. And nowhere is this more visible than in warfare. Before metal weapons became widespread, conflict certainly existed, but Bronze Age warfare intensified violence in important ways. Bronze swords, spearheads, helmets, shields, and armor transformed organized combat. Cities surrounded themselves with walls. Armies became more structured. Chariots appeared in some regions, combining metal technology with animal domestication into powerful military systems. Warfare evolved from scattered local clashes into something increasingly organized, strategic, and state-driven. Ancient rulers no longer depended solely on personal strength or tribal loyalty. Metal allowed centralized military power to expand over larger territories. Empires became possible, partly because bronze made domination more efficient. And still, for all its practical impact, metal retained something almost spiritual in the ancient imagination. Gold, especially, became deeply connected to eternity, divinity, and immortality. Unlike iron or bronze, gold does not rust or corrode easily. It survives centuries underground, still shining. Ancient Egyptians associated gold with the flesh of the gods. Pharaohs covered tombs, statues, and sacred objects with it, partly because its permanence symbolized divine power beyond death. To ancient minds, metal often blurred the line between material and sacred reality. Meteoric iron carried even greater mystery. Before humans learned to smelt iron from ore, rare pieces of iron occasionally fell from the sky inside meteorites. Ancient civilizations sometimes treated this metal from heaven as sacred. Tutankhamun's famous dagger, for example, appears to contain meteoric iron. Imagine how strange such material would have seemed before industrial knowledge existed. A strong metallic substance literally descending from the heavens. The sky itself appeared to be giving gifts to kings. Eventually, humans learned how to smelt iron from terrestrial ore, though this required far higher temperatures and more advanced furnace techniques than bronze production. Once iron technology spread, another massive transformation followed. Iron was harder, more abundant, and ultimately cheaper than bronze, once societies mastered production methods. This democratized metal in some ways. Tools and weapons became more accessible. Agricultural expansion accelerated further. Forests were cleared on larger scales. populations grew, states expanded aggressively. Entire landscapes changed under iron tools. Historians sometimes describe iron as the metal that built empires. But the transition from bronze to iron was not immediate or smooth. For centuries, both systems coexisted. Some ancient societies resisted adopting iron quickly because bronze remained prestigious and reliable. Others lacked the resources or knowledge needed for large-scale iron production. The ancient world was never developing in a straight line. It was fragmented, uneven, experimental. Yet across different civilizations, one pattern remained clear. Once humans learned to control metal, civilization itself became more powerful, more interconnected, and more dangerous. And perhaps that is the deeper story hidden beneath ancient metallurgy. Metal changed how humans related to nature. Stone tools worked with the world as it existed. Metal required extracting hidden resources from beneath the earth, reshaping them through intense heat, and transforming raw matter into entirely new forms. This demanded planning, labor systems, mining operations, trade routes, furnaces, workshops, and specialized knowledge. Civilization became increasingly artificial, increasingly dependent on controlling processes invisible to ordinary people. In some sense, metallurgy marked humanity's transition from adapting to nature toward actively remaking it. Mines scarred landscapes. Forests disappeared to fuel furnaces. Trade systems expanded across continents, searching for ore. Human ambition deepened underground itself. And yet, despite all this advancement, ancient metalworking remained precarious. Mines collapsed. Supply routes failed. Famine interrupted production. Skilled craftsmen died. Kingdoms lost access to critical materials. Civilizations that appeared invincible could weaken surprisingly fast when the systems supporting them fractured. Beneath the shining armor, gold masks, and monumental empires remained vulnerability. Metal amplified both human creativity and human instability at the same time. And perhaps that duality explains why ancient myths so often treated metal with both awe and fear. Fire and metal together gave humans unprecedented power, but they also transformed warfare, inequality, labor, and conquest forever. The same bronze that shaped ceremonial beauty also forged swords. The same gold that symbolized eternity also fueled greed and empire. Civilization became brighter, richer, stronger, and far more dangerous. Because once humans learned how to pull power directly from the earth itself, there was no returning to the older world of stone. At some point in the ancient world, villages stopped being enough. Small farming communities had already spread across fertile valleys and river systems for thousands of years. Trade networks connected distant cultures. Temples organized ritual life. Metal weapons strengthened armies. Cities rose beside rivers where agriculture could support growing populations. But then something changed again. Certain rulers, cities, and societies began wanting more than survival, more than local control, more than simply protecting their own territory. They wanted dominance, not over a single settlement, but over entire regions filled with strangers speaking different languages, worshipping different gods and living under different traditions. This was the birth of empire. And once the first empires appeared, human history entered a far more dangerous phase. Because an empire is not simply a large kingdom. It is a system designed to absorb other societies into itself. It gathers people, resources, labor, belief, and violence into centralized power on a scale the prehistoric world had never experienced before. The earliest roots of empire appeared in Mesopotamia, the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where some of humanity's first cities emerged. The region did not naturally favor political unity. Unlike Egypt, which developed around the long, predictable corridor of the Nile, Mesopotamia contained multiple competing city-states spread across open plains, vulnerable to invasion. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Kish developed independently, each surrounded by farmland, irrigation canals, temples, and defensive walls. At first, these cities functioned almost like separate worlds. Each had its own ruler, patron deity, and political identity. But prosperity created competition. Water access mattered. Trade mattered. Farmland mattered. And eventually, conflict became unavoidable. Some of the earliest written records humanity possesses are not philosophical reflections or religious prayers, but administrative records tied to labor, taxation, and resource management. Civilization had become complicated enough that memory alone no longer worked. Writing emerged partly because rulers needed to track grain, workers, trade goods, and obligations across growing urban populations. In a strange way, bureaucracy was born almost simultaneously with empire itself. Power required information, and information became a weapon. One of the first rulers often associated with true empire was Sargon of Akkad, who lived more than 4,000 years ago. According to later records, Sargon rose from relatively humble origins before conquering Mesopotamian city-states and creating what many historians consider one of the world's earliest empires. Whether every story about him is accurate remains uncertain because ancient rulers often surrounded themselves with myth. But what matters is the pattern. For the first time, a single political authority controlled multiple cities and peoples across a large territory. Conquest was no longer temporary raiding. It became administration. Empires required roads, messengers, taxation systems, standing armies, and ideological control capable of holding distant regions together. This transformed the psychology of civilization. In small communities, power remains personal. People know their leaders directly. But empires create distance between rulers and ordinary life. A farmer working beside an irrigation canal may never see the king whose demands shaped his labor. Power becomes abstract, symbolic, almost godlike. This is partly why early emperors often connected themselves to divine authority. Religion helped stabilize enormous political systems by making obedience feel sacred rather than merely forced. In Egypt, pharaohs were considered divine intermediaries, maintaining cosmic order itself. The flooding of the Nile, agricultural fertility, and stability of society became spiritually connected to royal authority. Massive monuments like pyramids projected permanence and control on scales ordinary people could barely comprehend. Yet Egypt's geography also helped protect and unify it. Mesopotamia was harsher, more unstable, more exposed. Armies crossed its plains repeatedly. Kingdoms rose and collapsed in cycles. Warfare became increasingly organized because survival depended on military strength. Ancient cities built walls not simply for prestige, but because invasion remained a constant possibility. The deeper civilizations expanded, the more resources they required, and resources demanded conquest. This created one of the oldest patterns in human history: empire feeding upon itself. Success generated military expansion. Expansion required administration. Administration required taxation and labor. Taxation fueled larger armies. Larger armies enabled further conquest. Over time, empires became machines designed to sustain their own growth, but maintaining them was extraordinarily difficult. Communication remained slow. Rebellions spread. Droughts disrupted food supplies. Trade routes collapsed. Rulers died unexpectedly. Ancient empires often looked stable from a distance, while internally balancing on fragile systems held together through force, ritual, and fear. And yet, despite that instability, empires also created remarkable forms of connection. Roads expanded, trade intensified, technologies spread across regions faster than before. Writing systems evolved, laws became formalized. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest surviving law codes emerged under Hammurabi of Babylon. Carved into stone, the code established punishments, contracts, property rules, and social regulations across a large kingdom. Modern people sometimes imagine ancient laws as primitive chaos, but early legal systems reveal something more sophisticated and unsettling. Civilization was becoming increasingly structured. Human behavior itself was now regulated through centralized authority. Empires did not simply conquer land, they organized reality. And beneath all this power were ordinary people whose lives transformed completely under imperial systems. Farmers produced grain not only for local survival, but for state storage and taxation. Laborers built walls, canals, temples, and roads. Soldiers marched into territories they had never seen before. Scribes recorded transactions endlessly onto clay tablets. Merchants traveled dangerous trade routes connecting distant cities. Slavery expanded in many societies as warfare generated captive populations. Empires concentrated wealth and opportunity, but they also concentrated suffering. Ancient monuments often hide this reality beneath grandeur. Behind every palace stood thousands of workers. Behind every victory stood graves. Yet humans repeatedly built empires anyway, because empires offered something profoundly seductive: order. The ancient world remained terrifyingly unpredictable. Floods destroyed harvests. Droughts triggered famine. Raiders attacked villages. Disease spread easily. Empires promised stability through scale. Large irrigation systems could support bigger populations. Organized armies could provide protection. Trade networks brought resources from faraway regions. For many people, imperial systems may genuinely have improved certain aspects of life. even while increasing inequality and control. This complexity matters because ancient civilizations were never simply oppressive machines or glorious golden ages. They were both at once. One of the most extraordinary examples of early imperial organization emerged in Assyria. The Assyrian Empire became infamous for military efficiency, psychological warfare, and administrative control. Ancient relief carvings depict sieges, conquests, and punishments with brutal clarity. Assyrian kings deliberately cultivated fear because fear stabilized empire. Yet Assyria also built roads, libraries, administrative systems, and communication networks connecting vast territories. This duality appears repeatedly throughout history. The same empires capable of extraordinary cultural achievement often depended on extraordinary violence to survive. And perhaps nowhere does imperial ambition become more emotionally overwhelming than in the rise of monumental capitals. Cities like Babylon, Nineveh, Memphis, and Thebes projected power physically through scale itself. Massive walls, towering gates, temples covered in gold, colossal statues, and processional roads created environments designed to make ordinary humans feel small before the state and the gods. Ancient rulers understood spectacle deeply. Architecture became political psychology. Entering an imperial capital was meant to feel overwhelming, because if power looked eternal, people were more likely to obey it. Yet almost every empire eventually discovered the same terrifying truth. Expansion creates vulnerability. The larger an empire became, the harder it was to control. Communication delays slowed responses to crises. Distant provinces rebelled. Rival powers adapted militarily. Environmental pressures intensified. Even successful conquest carried hidden risks, because conquered populations rarely forgot their independence completely. Ancient empires spent enormous energy suppressing fragmentation, constantly threatening to tear them apart. In many cases, collapse came not from one dramatic invasion, but from systems slowly overstretching beyond what they could sustain. Climate may also have played a larger role in imperial instability than ancient rulers fully understood. Modern researchers studying drought patterns, crop failures, and environmental stress increasingly suspect that ecological disruption contributed to several ancient collapses. Empires depended heavily on agricultural surplus. When weather patterns shifted or harvests failed repeatedly, political systems weakened quickly. The ancient world never escaped dependence on nature, no matter how powerful rulers became. This created an almost tragic pattern throughout early civilization. Humans built increasingly sophisticated systems, trying to control uncertainty. Yet, uncertainty always returned, eventually, through drought, plague, invasion, economic breakdown, or internal conflict. No empire solved that permanently. Still, the first empires changed humanity forever, because they introduced entirely new scales of identity and organization. People no longer belonged only to family, tribe, or city. Now they belonged to civilizations stretching across enormous territories. Shared languages, laws, currencies, religions, and political systems linked strangers together in ways impossible during prehistory. the human world became larger, psychologically as well as geographically. And perhaps the most important transformation happened quietly beneath all the visible power. Empires reshaped time itself. Rulers now thought in generations rather than seasons. Dynasties planned monuments meant to outlive individuals by centuries. Historical memory became political. Kings recorded victories to control how the future would remember them. Writing preserved imperial narratives, while countless ordinary lives vanished, unrecorded, beneath them. History itself increasingly became the story of states, rulers, and conquests, because empires possessed the resources to preserve their own memory. Yet behind the stone inscriptions and royal propaganda remained fragile human beings, still haunted by the same fears as prehistoric ancestors: fear of death, famine, disaster, and collapse. Ancient emperors may have ruled enormous territories, but they still watched eclipses with anxiety. They still feared divine anger. They still relied on harvests, rivers, and seasons they could not fully control. And perhaps that is what makes the first empires feel both magnificent and unsettling at the same time. Humanity had become powerful enough to dominate continents, but not powerful enough to escape uncertainty. History feels solid when it is written down. Names carved into stone seem permanent. Kings, battles, cities, and empires appear fixed inside time, as if the past can still be reached clearly through records and ruins. But the deeper archaeologists dig beneath the beginning of recorded history, the more unstable the human story becomes. Entire centuries dissolve into silence. Civilizations appear suddenly, without clear origins. Languages survive in fragments nobody can fully read. Monuments remain standing long after the beliefs that created them disappeared. And beneath modern oceans, forests, deserts, and cities may lie enormous pieces of humanity's forgotten past, places where people once lived, traded, worshipped, fought, and vanished without leaving names behind. One of the strangest truths about human history is that most of it is missing. Writing emerged only recently compared to the vast length of human existence. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years, yet the earliest widely accepted writing systems appeared only around 5,000 years ago. That means more than 98% of the human story unfolded before written history began preserving memory. Entire worlds existed before anyone recorded them. And even after writing emerged, most people still left behind no personal trace at all. History remembers rulers because rulers could afford stone, scribes, monuments, and archives. Ordinary lives disappeared far more easily. Fires erased libraries. Floods buried settlements. Forests swallowed roads. Sea levels drowned coastlines. Civilizations collapsed so completely that later cultures sometimes forgot they had ever existed. This is why archaeology often feels less like reading history and more like recovering fragments from a dream. A broken pot, a buried wall, a human skeleton beside jewelry no one fully understands. Tiny pieces of evidence surrounded by enormous silence. And sometimes, that silence creates unsettling questions. How many societies vanished before anyone could record them? how many cities remain undiscovered beneath modern landscapes? How much knowledge disappeared forever simply because the materials carrying it decayed? The ancient world was far more fragile than people often imagine. Papyrus rotted, wood burned, cloth dissolved. Even stone erodes eventually. Entire civilizations can vanish almost completely under the right conditions. One of the most haunting examples lies beneath the sea. Around the world, archaeologists continue discovering evidence of submerged prehistoric landscapes flooded after the Ice Age. Beneath the North Sea rests Doggerland, once a vast plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe. Off the coasts of India, underwater structures have sparked debates about ancient settlements now buried beneath rising oceans. Along the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, researchers continue investigating drowned coastlines where humans may have lived before sea levels rose dramatically after the last ice age. Some discoveries remain controversial, and exaggerated claims often spread faster than careful science. But the broader reality is undeniable. Enormous areas once inhabited by prehistoric humans now lie underwater beyond easy reach. This matters because humans throughout history tended to settle near coasts, rivers, and fertile lowlands, precisely the places most vulnerable to flooding as glaciers melted. In other words, some of the oldest chapters of civilization may literally rest beneath the sea. And perhaps that is partly why ancient myths across cultures speak so often about lost lands and drowned worlds. Most scholars reject sensational ideas about highly advanced, forgotten global civilizations destroyed in sudden catastrophe. There is no strong evidence for prehistoric societies possessing industrial technology or modern scientific systems long before known civilizations emerged. Yet, the emotional power of those theories reveals something important. People instinctively sense that the archaeological record is incomplete. We know entire landscapes vanished. We know ancient populations existed in places now inaccessible. We know writing appeared surprisingly late. The missing pieces invite imagination because the silence itself feels enormous. Sometimes, however, real archaeological discoveries are strange enough without exaggeration. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey completely changed assumptions about early civilization because monumental ritual structures appeared there thousands of years earlier than many expected. Sites in the Amazon, once dismissed as untouched wilderness, now show evidence of enormous engineered landscapes created by ancient societies. LiDAR technology scanning beneath jungle canopies has revealed hidden cities, roads, canals, and agricultural systems across Central America and Southeast Asia. Civilizations once thought isolated or primitive often turn out to have been far more sophisticated than earlier researchers imagined. The ancient world keeps becoming larger and more complicated every time new evidence emerges. And one of the most mysterious parts of that complexity involves language itself. Throughout history, entire writing systems vanished completely after civilizations collapsed. Some were eventually deciphered. Others remain silent even now. The ancient script, known as Linear A from Bronze Age Crete, still cannot be fully read, despite decades of study. The symbols of the Indus Valley civilization, which flourished thousands of years ago in parts of modern Pakistan and India, remain undeciphered as well. We know these people traded, built cities, organized large populations, and developed complex urban systems. Yet, their voices remain trapped behind symbols modern scholars cannot fully unlock. Imagine discovering an entire civilization, but being unable to understand what its people wrote about themselves. Their politics, fears, myths, names, beliefs, and daily thoughts remain hidden behind silence. This happens more often than most people realize. Even civilizations with surviving written records often preserve only fragments of their original knowledge. The Library of Alexandria became legendary partly because it symbolized the destruction of accumulated memory itself. Ancient texts vanished through war, neglect, censorship, environmental decay, and simple accident. Greek tragedies disappeared, scientific works vanished, religious traditions fractured. Entire schools of thought survive only through references made by later writers. What modern people call history is often merely the tiny percentage of material lucky enough to survive long enough to be copied repeatedly. And survival was never guaranteed. Sometimes, entire populations disappeared so completely that later societies invented myths to explain ruins they no longer understood. This happened repeatedly throughout history. Ancient Egyptians explored monuments already ancient to them. Medieval Europeans created legends about Roman ruins whose original purposes they barely understood. In Central America, later cultures encountered abandoned cities swallowed by jungle. Humans repeatedly inherit broken fragments of older worlds without fully understanding the people who built them. There is something strangely humbling about that pattern. It suggests civilization forgets far more than it remembers. And perhaps the most haunting examples involve places where sophisticated societies appear to have declined rapidly for reasons still debated. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC shattered major civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East within a relatively short period. Palace systems burned, trade routes collapsed, writing disappeared from some regions for centuries. Historians still debate the causes: climate change, invasions, earthquakes, famine, internal rebellion, economic instability, or combinations of all of them. What matters is how quickly complexity unraveled. The ancient world was more interconnected than many people assume, which also made it more vulnerable. Once systems broke apart, knowledge vanished with them. This fragility appears elsewhere too. The Maya built extraordinary cities, astronomical systems, calendars, and monumental architecture across Mesoamerica. Yet many major southern lowland cities were eventually abandoned. Environment stress, warfare, political instability, and drought may all have contributed. But scholars still debate the exact mechanisms behind the collapse. What remains today are ruins emerging from forests where entire urban populations once lived. The silence surrounding those abandoned cities feels almost physical. And perhaps that silence is what fascinates humans most about lost civilizations. Not simply the ruins themselves, but the realization that societies once filled with ordinary life can disappear so completely. Markets vanish, languages vanish, families vanish, songs vanish. the world moves on as if they were never there. Even modern archaeology can only recover fragments. Pottery styles reveal trade. Bones reveal diet and disease. DNA reveals migration. But countless human experiences remain inaccessible forever. We will never fully know what many ancient people believed when they stared at the stars, buried their dead, or watched their cities collapse around them. Sometimes, even the identities of monumental builders remain uncertain. The people responsible for certain megalithic structures across Europe left no written explanation of their intentions. Their monuments survived, their voices did not. And this creates a strange imbalance in how humanity remembers itself. Stone outlives language. Architecture outlives emotion. Monuments outlive meaning. Modern people often look at ancient ruins and project certainty onto them because the physical structures remain visible. But the deeper human realities behind them are often gone. Archaeology reconstructs patterns carefully, but many conclusions remain provisional, open to revision with each new discovery. This uncertainty frustrates some people, yet it may actually reflect the true nature of history more honestly than rigid narratives do. The past was never clean or fully preserved. It survives unevenly through accidents of climate, geography, destruction, and luck. Some ancient societies used durable stone inscriptions. Others recorded memory on wood, cloth, or oral traditions that disappeared easily. This means the civilizations we know best are not necessarily the most important or advanced. They are often simply the ones that survived preservation more successfully. And then there are the places humanity has barely explored at all. Vast deserts still hide buried settlements beneath sand. Dense rainforests continue concealing ancient earthworks and ruins invisible from ground level. Underwater archaeology remains limited because oceans are difficult and expensive to investigate. Even now, new discoveries constantly reshape understanding of prehistory and early civilization. Entire cities emerge from beneath jungle canopies through LiDAR scans. Ancient DNA reveals forgotten migrations. Submerged structures raise new questions about prehistoric coastlines. The map of human history remains unfinished. Yet, perhaps the deepest mystery is not what vanished physically, but what vanished psychologically. How many ways of understanding the world disappeared with forgotten cultures? Ancient societies carried mythologies, philosophies, rituals, ecological knowledge, and symbolic systems modern civilization no longer fully remembers. Some indigenous oral traditions preserved environmental understanding accumulated across thousands of years. Some ancient astronomical alignments revealed generations of careful sky observation. Some agricultural systems sustained populations in difficult environments for centuries before being abandoned or erased. Not all lost knowledge was mystical or technologically advanced. Much of it may simply have been deeply local, tied to landscapes and experiences now gone. And maybe that is the most unsettling realization of all. Civilization often imagines itself moving forward permanently, accumulating knowledge endlessly. But history suggests something more fragile. Humans forget Constantly, entire worlds disappear beneath water, forest, ash, war, or silence. Future civilizations may one day look at the ruins of modern cities with the same uncertainty we feel standing inside ancient ones. They may recover fragments while misunderstanding the people who created them. They may invent myths to explain technologies they no longer fully grasp. Because beneath all human achievement lies the same vulnerability that shaped the ancient world. Memory survives only if something carries it forward, and most of the time, almost everything is eventually lost. There was never a single day when prehistory ended and the ancient world began. No trumpet sounded across the earth. No civilization suddenly awakened fully formed beneath the morning sun. The transition happened slowly, unevenly, across thousands of years and countless human lives. Some people were already building cities, while others still hunted across forests and grasslands, much as their ancestors had for generations. Some societies developed writing, while neighboring cultures carried memory entirely through oral tradition. Human history did not move forward together in one straight line. It fractured, overlapped, accelerated, and collapsed in different places at different times. And yet, somewhere inside that long transition, humanity crossed another invisible boundary. The moment people began recording themselves clearly enough that their voices could survive beyond memory alone. That moment changed everything. Before writing, human experience vanished almost as quickly as it occurred. Stories survived only if spoken repeatedly. Knowledge survived only if taught directly from one generation to another. Entire worlds could disappear in silence if disease, war, famine, or disaster broke the chain of memory. But once humans learned to preserve language physically, history itself transformed. Thoughts could now outlive the people who created them. Kings could speak across centuries. Laws could remain stable after rulers died. Myths could travel beyond the communities that first imagined them. Civilization became capable of remembering itself in entirely new ways. The earliest writing systems did not begin as literature or philosophy. They emerged from administration. Ancient cities had become too large and complex for memory alone. Grain had to be counted. Taxes had to be tracked. Trade goods moved between regions. Workers required organization. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed wedge-shaped symbols into clay tablets to record transactions, labor, livestock, and supplies. At first, these markings were practical tools for controlling increasingly complicated urban societies. But once symbols began representing language itself, rather than simple quantities, something profound happened. Human thought detached from the human voice. Memory no longer depended entirely on living minds. And perhaps the strangest part is that the people experiencing this transformation may not have realized how revolutionary it truly was. To them, writing was simply useful, yet it quietly altered consciousness itself. Oral cultures remember differently than literate ones. In oral societies, stories often remain fluid, changing slightly through performance and repetition. Memory becomes collective and rhythmic. Knowledge is carried inside people. writing changes that relationship. Information can now exist outside the body permanently. This allows far greater accumulation of detail, law, mathematics, astronomy, administration, and historical continuity. But it also changes how humans think about truth, authority, and time. Written words appear fixed, permanent. Ancient civilizations understood this quickly. Kings carved victories into stone because stone outlived flesh. Laws written publicly gained authority beyond personal memory. Religious texts stabilized belief systems across generations. Civilization became increasingly dependent on archives, scribes, and recorded knowledge. And alongside writing came another transformation, equally important: the rise of organized historical identity. Earlier humans certainly remembered ancestors and past events, but ancient civilizations began systematically recording dynasties, reigns, battles, and cosmic timelines. The past became political. Rulers understood that controlling memory helped control power. Egyptian pharaohs covered temples with inscriptions presenting themselves as eternal guardians of divine order. Mesopotamian kings described conquests and building projects in monumental detail. Later empires would continue the pattern endlessly. History became something curated, preserved intentionally. This is partly why the ancient world feels more familiar to modern people than prehistory does. Once writing emerges, individual humans begin speaking directly to the future. Suddenly, we encounter names, fears, ambitions, prayers, arguments, and emotions preserved across thousands of years. A merchant complains about poor quality copper in a Mesopotamian tablet. An Egyptian scribe worries about work. A ruler boasts about victory. A poet reflects on mortality. Ancient people stop feeling like distant abstractions and begin sounding unmistakably human. Yet even as civilization entered recorded history, enormous mysteries remained unsolved. The ancient world still lived close to uncertainty. Most people did not understand disease scientifically. Natural disasters still carried religious meaning. Eclipses inspired fear. Drought could destroy kingdoms. Death remained everywhere. And perhaps this is why early civilizations became obsessed with systems capable of creating order from chaos. Mathematics advanced because trade, architecture, taxation, and astronomy required precision. Calendars became increasingly important because agriculture depended on predicting seasons accurately. Astronomy flourished because the sky appeared to contain patterns more reliable than human politics. Ancient priests, scribes, and scholars carefully tracked celestial movements, not simply from curiosity, but because survival itself depended on understanding cycles of time. In Mesopotamia, astronomer priests recorded planetary motions and eclipses with astonishing care. In Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile shaped calendars and sacred ritual. In Mesoamerica, later civilizations built entire ceremonial systems around cosmic timing. Across the ancient world, civilization increasingly organized itself around measurement of seasons, land, labor, taxes, stars, and time itself. This may have been one of humanity's deepest psychological transformations. Prehistoric life flowed largely through natural rhythms and local memory. Ancient civilization increasingly imposed abstract systems onto reality. Calendars divided time, laws divided behavior, borders divided land, writing divided memory into records and archives. Human beings were now living inside structures created almost entirely by other humans. Cities expanded, bureaucracies multiplied, trade routes connected distant cultures, armies marched beneath banners representing kingdoms larger than any individual community. The scale of civilization became enormous compared to the small hunter-gatherer bands humanity evolved within. And this created tension beneath the surface of the ancient world. Civilization brought stability, but also dependence. Writing preserved knowledge, but also centralized power. Empires connected cultures, but also spread warfare and inequality across larger territories. Ancient societies achieved extraordinary things: monumental architecture, legal systems, literature, astronomy, engineering, long-distance trade, yet all of it rested on fragile foundations, vulnerable to collapse. The farther civilization advanced, the more complex and interconnected it became. Complexity created both brilliance and instability simultaneously. This pattern appeared repeatedly. In Mesopotamia, kingdoms rose and fell beside the same rivers for centuries. Egypt experienced periods of unity interrupted by fragmentation and crisis. The Indus Valley civilization developed remarkably advanced urban planning, drainage systems, and standardized construction. Yet, much about its political structure and eventual decline remains uncertain because its writing system still resists full decipherment. Ancient China developed dynasties, bronze technology, and sophisticated ritual systems, while also experiencing cycles of warfare and consolidation. The ancient world was never static. It was alive with movement, adaptation, ambition, and fear. And, despite all its advances, much of humanity still remained outside recorded civilization entirely. Vast regions of the world continued operating through oral traditions, tribal systems, nomadic cultures, and local spiritual frameworks. Prehistory did not disappear overnight simply because writing emerged in certain cities. Different human worlds coexisted simultaneously. Some societies built monumental capitals, while others moved seasonally through forests and plains, much as their ancestors had for thousands of years. Civilization spread unevenly, shaped by geography, climate, trade, migration, and conflict. Yet, over time, the influence of literate urban societies grew stronger. Writing allowed states to organize labor more efficiently. Laws became enforceable across larger territories. Religious systems spread through preserved texts. Historical continuity strengthened dynasties. Knowledge accumulated instead of constantly restarting. Humanity had entered a new phase where ideas themselves could survive independently of living memory. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this transition is how incomplete it remained. Even at the dawn of recorded history, ancient people were already surrounded by ruins older than themselves. Egyptians explored monuments whose builders were separated from them by centuries. Mesopotamian civilizations inherited myths from earlier cultures. Ancient societies looked backward constantly, trying to understand forgotten ancestors, just as modern people do today. The sense of living after a mysterious past is not modern at all. It existed from the very beginning of civilization. Humans have always felt surrounded by lost worlds. And maybe that is because history never truly replaces prehistory. Beneath every empire, city, and written record remains the deeper human story, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years before the first king carved his name into stone. The instincts, fears, emotions, and myths shaping civilization emerged long before writing preserved them. Ancient people stood at the edge between those worlds. Behind them lay the enormous silence of prehistory. Hunter-gatherers crossing vanished landscapes, forgotten rituals beneath ice age skies, drowned coastlines now hidden beneath oceans. Ahead of them lay recorded civilization with its empires, wars, philosophies, religions, sciences, and monumental achievements. They were living inside the transition itself without fully understanding where it would lead. And perhaps that is what makes the beginning of the ancient world feel so strangely emotional. Humanity had finally learned how to preserve memory beyond a single lifetime. Yet even as civilization entered history, most of the human story was already gone forever. The first scribes writing onto clay tablets could not know they stood at the edge of an irreversible transformation. They were simply solving practical problems inside growing cities. But in doing so, they changed the relationship between humanity and time itself. For the first time, people could speak directly to the distant future. And thousands of years later, across ruined cities, broken monuments, buried tablets, and fading inscriptions, those voices are still reaching us now. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight on Sleepy Earth Channel. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten past, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment telling me what ancient mystery or prehistoric topic you'd like to explore next. Wherever you are in the world tonight, I hope you have a peaceful night and a little extra luck tomorrow. Sleep well.